Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Connors, pronouns she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. We are a virtual literary arts space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the lands of the Kickapoo, Nipmuc, Agawam, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to preserve and celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. As we do this land acknowledgement, we want to recognize those who are suffering from conquest and terror in Gaza, Ukraine, Congo, and Sudan. Our thoughts are with them. We know that these are stressful times just in general, and we are glad that you have joined us tonight to celebrate community. And now I would love to welcome Lisa to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Allen. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. We're so grateful that you're here with us tonight. In her new memoir, Metal Work, Jessica Johnson writes, "But real-life mining leaves a hole where the ore was, a disturbance. Byproduct compounds inert below the surface turn toxic in the air. The holes might or might not be filled in, but the process yields aftermaths." And in the bomb cloud of the first atomic bomb ever detonated near a country's own civilians, Tyler Mills quotes Richard Rhodes of Smithsonian Magazine. "The shards left behind, embedded in the earth, surface as though to remind us that the story is not finished, not whole." She continues to write, "What we have created unintentionally is a dialogue between nature and time, legible even when we stop digging into the core of who we are. And that's what we've done." These two memoirs, both written by poets, are lyrical and beautifully written, but they're more than that. They're a conversation in and of themselves, a reminder that life is both excavation and explosion, that nature and time continue as we interrogate, as we try to make meaning of the experiences that are uniquely ours in order to share them, and in order to fill holes we may never see, but others feel. If you haven't yet read these memoirs, I'm here to tell you that you should. And I know this because I ran out of sticky flags when I was reading, and that's really probably the best honor that I can bestow on books. Both are available through bookshop.org, and you can find the link on our website, and we will drop it here in the chat. And now our guests' official bios. Jessica E. Johnson writes poetry and nonfiction. She's the author of the book-length poem Metabolics and the chapbook In Absolutes We Seek Each Other, and is a contributor to the anthology Cascadia Field Guide, Art, Ecology, Poetry. Her poems, essays, and reviews have appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House, The New Republic, Poetry Northwest, River Teeth, Diagram, Annulet Poetics, the Southeast Review, and Sixth Finch. She teaches at Portland Community College and co-hosts the Constellation Reading Series at Tin House. Tyler Mills is the author of the memoir The Bomb Cloud, Unbound Edition Press 2024, which received a literature grant from the Cafe Royal Foundation, NYC. Her poetry guidebook, Poetry Studio Prompts for Poets, is also being released this year from the University of Akron Press. She is the author of the poetry books City Scattered from Tupelo Press 2022, Hawk Parable, University of Akron Press 2019, Tongue Lear, Crab Orchard Series in Poetry First Book Award from Southern Illinois University Press 2013, and co-author with Kendra DeColo of Low Budget Movie from Diode Editions 2021. A poet and essayist, her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Kenyon Review, The Believer, and Poetry, and her essays in Agni, Brevity, Copper Nickel, River Teeth, and The Rumpus. She teaches for Sarah Lawrence College's Writing Institute and the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center's 24 Pearl Street, and lives in Brooklyn. And now I'm going to turn over the floor to Jessica and Tyler.
Thank you so much. Wow. Lisa, I love what you said about how our work share like fills holes that others feel, but that you can never see. I thought that that was amazing. And I love Jessica's memoir so much. So such a
Yeah.
to
And
be here.
Tyler and I published in the same issue of River Teeth. And that's I think when I realized that we were maybe on to some similar themes and some poet memoir, some environmental-ish poet memoir. uh, and I'm really grateful that we have the opportunity to do this. I don't know if we talked about who's going to read first.
I would love to volunteer you, but I know that's not
Okay.
you know.
I don't mind. I can go first. That's fine. So I think that our plan is to each read a little bit from our books, and we have some questions for each other, and we really, really want to hear from all of you. And I am so grateful to you for being here. I know it's hot, probably where many of you are, and it's maybe just a nice summer day for some others of you. So thank you for making time for this. I'm going to read just a couple of sections of metalwork. And yeah, I'm going to read a couple sections. So what starts this book off is I receive 2 letters. When my daughter is just born, I received 2 letters from my mother that she wrote when she was raising me in mining camps in the very remote West. And those letters spark my own sense that the past is maybe not past, is still very much with me as an inheritance, especially as I have a child of my own, and I think about the maternal role as I've seen it, and also what I experienced as a child. So I'm going to start with a couple of memories that are sparked by my first receiving those letters. This is what I remember of our encampments. A tent frame made by 2x4s and pale canvas, studying the squares made by shadows and sunlight on its walls. A summer night in a trailer, Dad home from work covered in dust and suddenly pressed into parental duty, falling asleep in the middle of a book. I remember a clear spring sky against fir trees, fiercely blue, and wondering if it was deep, if it had a boundary, if it was a substance. Baby Andy pounding on a window in the morning as a bulldozer headed to the mine site. The smallness of my own boot measured against a bulldozer's tracks through heavy mud. The mine smelled like damp stone, and men smelled like diesel when they stood around outside our tent talking shop, disregarding us, when I wanted nothing more than to be central, part of some activity that mattered after a long day playing alone. A whiff of chlorine from a motel swimming pool smelled like a built environment, people, possibility. From our hours-long rattling over gravel into town for groceries and drinking water, I remember the cursive allure of Coca-Cola signs, the high orange rotating ball at the 76 station, and how I imagined myself curled up inside it. Girls bearing towers of soft serve ice cream smiled at us as they leaned out the windows of the drive-in. Their hair feathered away from their faces, and their eyelids sparkled crystal blue and purple. Back in camp, I dreamed myself into their existence, using the sight of them, Beatrix Potter and Winnie the Pooh stories, and a Juice Newton song from Baker City AM radio as raw material for a fantasy social life involving tea parties, eyeshadow, and rodeo queens. As early as I can remember, I woke up longing for other places. I remember the entwinement of Dad and work, of men and work. He left and left and left for work, and his work was the deep cause of everything we experienced. I remember wishing to grow up to be him instead of her. I imagine myself into a future where I wouldn't be the one left in the making do. Ours was an extreme setting, a narrow sort of social ecotone, and it didn't take much for me to become unnatural, impossible, strange, a girl who wanted to be something else, a kind of woman she'd never seen. In my memories of camp, my mother is almost never an image so much as a feeling of immensity that I traveled near and needed to stay close to. I longed for changes in the weather, for snow, for sun, or for the ominous darkness of a coming thunderstorm. I remember how her changes could surprise me, how much a kind of providence she was, coming up with a song to break my boredom, her voice turning harsh in what seemed like a sudden loss of patience. And then I would like to skip ahead to the present day. Okay. This is going back to work after parental leave, which was actually just summer break because I happened to like coincide my childbirth with the academic calendar. And then in September, when Clementine was 4 months old, I left. Every morning I packed up and traveled south and east along the hem of Portland's outskirts, an industrial and post-industrial string of man-world enterprises grown up along the Columbia Slough, wastewater treatment plant, sugar factory, strip club, warehouse, steel company, shuttered lounge, to an outpost of the large community college system where I had, for the first time in years, a full-time job with insurance that would cover family, a full-time temporary job, good for a year and maybe longer if I did it well enough. In the outside world, I was suddenly visible and unsure of how to dress myself. I did not know when I signed the rental agreement on the breast pump that it had to be transported in an absurdly large, strangely shaped black card case. Along with papers, books, and my laptop, I lugged it to meetings and trainings and orientations on the college's more central campuses, each with its own lactation setup, generally a single room in a distant building, unreservable, serving potentially hundreds of lactating people. "Do you teach music? Is that a French horn?" a colleague asked as I wrestled it between tightly packed chairs at a conference table. In the glow of slideshows about active shooter protocols, I thought about what Clementine might be doing in her crib at Kevin's mom's house, in her car seat riding along on her grandma's errands, drinking from a bottle I didn't prepare. Did I need this job? Without question, we needed the paycheck and health insurance. That was simple and true. It was also true that I found myself leaning into it a good deal more than I had to, drawing energy, at least at first, from having a little bit of space. The hurt wasn't as simple as wanting to be home and not being able to. I'll stop there and hand it over to Tyler.
Jessica, I loved that so much. And I loved how the moment where a colleague thought the breast pump was a French horn, and it made me think of that almost like a metaphor somehow. I could just see the poet's mind at work there, and in so many other parts of your memoir, your beautiful memoir, which I love so much. Yes, and just the way it talks about like motherhood and labor and all kinds of work and landscapes. So very excited about it. I'm going to read a little bit from The Bomb Cloud, which was an extension of my book of poems, Hawk Parable, and it started with a family mystery of my grandfather giving a photo album to my mother, and it had an atomic cloud in it, and he said he was part of the mission but didn't want to talk about it. And so it became a kind of quest where I was trying to uncover his story, and I also found myself working with secrets and the Manhattan Project, and realizing that he was part of a bomb wing that even now is still classified. And so the book looks at a lot of texts and archives that way, and it also has some of my visual works in it too, as I was wrestling with this subject matter. And I spent some of my time writing this book when I was living and working in New Mexico under the shadow of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and New Mexico being, as I'm sure you know, where the Trinity bomb was detonated. I learned that my grandfather was stationed right there as well before shipping out to the Pacific Theater. So the book tangles with all of those things. And I'm going to read a section from a longer essay called Boom. And this is about an explosion that we could hear in Santa Fe from Los Alamos. And then it looks into the history of Los Alamos as well. So I'm just going to read the first part of this essay, and then if there's time, a flash essay. Boom, a story of erasure, accident, and exposure in the New Mexico desert. Mountains curtained the sky ahead of us. Spring hadn't arrived, but the sun blasting the paling road, the finch feather grass, and the torches of evergreen all the same. Time seemed suspended, but not in seasonless sunshine. Instead, I passed through something like time on the safety corridor on 502 to Los Alamos. As I rounded a cliff, light splashed over my shoulders and like hose water all over the hood of the car. Oppenheimer vacationed here in what he thought of as impossibly remote terrain. Before the shock wave, before the light became something more than light, visible only the instant the blast cooled just enough for the cameras. Cameras captured the images we know, the bulbs, the mushrooms, the turrets of clouds. When you are here in New Mexico, where the potential for infinite destruction all began, you feel like you are in a photograph, but seconds still tick at the wrist like blood sluicing through a vein. Before a tower dropped the Trinity bomb in what is now the White Sands Missile Range, boys put frogs in each other's beds at the Los Alamos Ranch School and cabins that would later become ad hoc labs and workshops for plutonium. This was before the facility became a campus, before the town gridded into housing developments and grocery stores, before we burned our way into a new geological epoch, before everything changed. On your way into town, the landscape leading into Los Alamos opens up to cliffs that frame the sky like a shag haircut. An ice cream scoop could have carved the rock out, and all the trees clinging to it in the wind hardly move, gnarled, twisted. Here, beauty is a word that arrives in the mind slowly, the way water boils an egg. Except for the make and model of the cars swerving past you on the corkscrew turns, and maybe except for the oddly warm winter, hardly any snow since January, which will mean more summer wildfires, the charged quality of the air tricks you into thinking you're back in time 70 years. If there is one spark, one cigarette, one blue pinprick of static at your sleeve, one open can of gasoline, could all of this vaporize? The name Los Alamos means the poplars, more specifically the cottonwoods that pour into the sky. The nuclear facility hums here, though you can't hear it. Everything around it pushes you away gently. You can enter the small science museum for free. You will not be tempted to purchase a book because the bookstore went out of business before you arrived. One rare afternoon, the Los Alamos National Laboratory's presence announced itself in Santa Fe. That winter morning, I was sipping mint tea in front of my laptop screen, hoping to settle the question mark curling in my stomach. All of a sudden, I heard a roar. Everything became part of the sound, its color a deep blue. My mind smeared like light between the stardust whirls of the Milky Way. Did a massive engine blast past my building, then vanish? I thought about guns, military jets. I went to the window and touched the glass, cold. Sun grazed the roofs of the cars in the lot below me, and beyond them, the field where prairie dogs burrow into the earth stretched out emptily. No one in a puffy vest and neon hat wandered down into the arroyo. The mountains rose like a stage backdrop, this time peach under a pale blue sky. Nothing. January was January, and I returned to my desk. The shape within me had grown a silky pelt of hair. I shivered and wrapped my cape-like synthetic sweater tighter around myself. Nothing stirred. The size of a pea pod, my secret could open and close its mouth in fists. Out my window overlooking the road, a U-Haul swerved around the bend, broadcasting the graphic of another state on the side of the truck. Colorado, a bighorn sheep. And so the New Mexico mountain town became ordinary again. But what really happened, I later learned, was anything but ordinary. So I'll pause there. And then I'd also like to read a flash essay that looks at New Mexico and living in New Mexico, and it's also about mothering as well during the early stages of motherhood. So let's find it. Okay, it's called Backdrop. Let's see. Backdrop, New Mexico. When I heard the wind, I knew my daughter would not sleep. From the motel window, Taos Mountain hid behind lavender snowfall, swinging thick fluff around its muscles like a towel. My daughter bit my areolas with her two bottom teeth. She squealed, happy when I winced. That day I counted her wet diapers, stained sunflower yellow, and worried she lost nourishment among the prickly pear and calla as I walked with her strapped to my chest. High desert afternoons fall 30 degrees at sundown and bring snow rolling off the mountains. My daughter had stopped drinking from a bottle or cup. For weeks now she only wanted me, my skin on her lips, the sugar from my blood in her mouth. The New Mexico wind can sound like a choir. It hummed into the cracks in deep windows, mud walls, and carved doors. Instead of muses, the night brought dissonance. I thought of the other being I carried and lost right before my daughter's cells clung to me. I had proudly displayed the photo booth-like images of that child that wasn't to be for visiting family who would cautiously say, "Ah, how sweet." From a town nestled in the Cerrillos Hills, I'd bought a tiny terracotta bud vase that rocked in my palm like a toy. For my table, I'd thought. The mouth would be perfect for the petunias I would later let starve on the deck, the pink and yellow petals fluttering in the wind before they began to wither like light leaving water. My daughter, at 9 months old, breathed the air of the desert as long as her lungs swelled with my fluid. Like so many others who came before me, I watched the mountain furrow with clouds, the fissures looking like trails the mind can touch. In a photo of my great-grandfather, young in Bohemia, he proudly poses for the turn-of-the-century studio portrait. New bicycle, stage prop, bowler hat, stage prop. He stands in front of a parlor that is actually a painting of a parlor. The corner of his mouth turns up. All this is my life now, his smile seems to say about the pose itself. Then he left Kozlani and his family of weavers. A photo I texted my mother a month into my daughter's life shows the infant plucking the yarn of a blanket like a harp. My mother crocheted this for her. Ribs rippled through the baby's upper back. I did not make enough milk. The pediatrician, rather than urging me to supplement with formula, instructed me to increase my supply. Take fenugreek pills, pump after you nurse, eat avocado, suck down the pink drink at Starbucks, check the latch again, do not let the baby nap while she nurses, eat oatmeal, bring her into your bed, do not bring her into your bed, meditate, massage your breasts, invite someone to stick needles into your chest, find women who can give you their extra breast milk. I followed advice from the pediatrician, lactation nurses, and internet message boards. At the doctor's recommendation, I met weekly with a lactation nurse. The perky woman pointed with claret and glitter fingernails at a breast-shaped pillow, saying nipple to nose, grabbed my baby's head, and shoved her face into my chest. Try football hold, she commanded. I broke like a field pocked with prairie dog holes. I broke like the cottonwoods cracking limbs off in the wind that scatters them around the roots, like prayers from mouths in a cemetery. I broke like a skull. My brain confused my daughter with one of the wouldn't-be children. Smiling in her stroller at the park, she would look at me with her marble blue eyes, and I would say, "That summer I lost you, She shifted the shadows of the fir trees off her newly plump legs. On Halloween, 3.5 months after a doctor sucked her out of my birth canal with a vacuum, my daughter finally reached 3% on the growth chart. I'd supplemented with Similac. This afternoon, when I opened a cafe door, I smelled raspberry incense and weed. The wide-eyed barista mumbled, "We're closed today," while she observed a man strum loud chords on a scuffed ukulele. Instead of writing, I returned to the motel, lifted my tank top up, and exposed myself. With her new bottom teeth, she took me in her mouth, jerked her chin back. Moons bloomed around my nipples. Not all nights arrive with stars. Thank you.
Tyler's work I'm not sure if supposed to talk to Tyler or to the audience, but your work is so visual, Tyler. Like it's so intense. That's one thing I love about your writing and all the genres is it's so you can see it, like it speaks to that part of my brain that wants to make and read image and just sees the world that way. And I love that about this book.
Thank you. A lot of my family are visual artists and I'm not. And I feel like I always wished I were, or like I wished I had that skill or something. So I don't know, I love working with color and texture, but I noticed that too about your work as well, just like how tactile it is. And I feel like you're like noticing the touch of stone and the scent of the earth. I love that.
I also have a lot of visual artists in the family. Some musicians too, but like, yes, I process the world really visually. Can I start it with a question? So I want to know, and this is not one we planned, but it's one that came to me. So this was an extension of a book of poetry, right? So what leads, I have my own thoughts about this, but what led you to want to approach similar, the same, or subject matter within the same family in prose?
That's a good question. And I'm curious about your answer too. I felt like when I was writing Hawk Parable, I kept reaching dead ends when it came to the family story. But I found myself also really learning so much about the violence of kind of the nuclear history and the Manhattan Project and the colonial violence of the nuclear tests the US conducted in the Marshall Islands. And so from for that book, I found myself really kind of wanting to reckon with that and engage with the lyric speaker in a way that could somehow speak through scientific texts, archival texts, and also thread back to the questions around a family story. And as I was writing the final poems of that book, I was living in New Mexico and was starting to look into the mystery even further and also writing about living there. And I felt like there was information I was gathering that just wasn't working in poems. And so that was the start of that journey. But then I found myself wanting to pursue the question as far as I possibly could. And so I felt like the kind of meditative space of the essay form invited me to do that. And the kind of way that I think about essays maybe circling around questions sometimes, I found that to be really productive, even though I did include a few poems in that book. Um, yeah. But how do you approach both genres in your work? Like how do you choose nonfiction versus poetry as it relates to your subject matter?
I think after this book, I am genre confused. I'm officially genre confused. It's more difficult for me to choose than it used to be. When sort of poetry was my default genre. But I know that an important thing for me for this book, it was similar concern about ethics around information and being able to use information as such in a way that my poetics didn't necessarily know how to do. Which is not to say that a person couldn't do that in poetry. I think there probably are people who can do just about anything in poetry. But the way that I knew how to write poetry, I didn't think I could do that. I also knew that one thing that I was pretty good at was sort of like a lyric mode that often amounted to like fragmentation or a sort of dodging away. And I knew that in this book, I wanted to do the opposite of that. I wanted to stay with the question, even when it was uncomfortable, and continue to pursue it and to make connections. And I had to learn how to write the book by writing the book. It was not like a skill set that I had. It was a skill set that I had, that the material had to help me acquire. But I guess to put it maybe more bluntly, I knew that if I wrote this as a poet in a way that I knew how to write poetry, I would end up sort of lying to myself, essentially. That like the poetry I had would have not amounted to an honest treatment.
Mm,
Which is not to say again that some poet probably could do it, but the way that I knew how to do it, I don't think I could have.
That's so interesting to think about fragments and what is a fragment and what isn't in a poem versus an essay. I'm fascinated with that too, because I love to write lyric essays that can so often be fragmentary and can so often look like poems, but then they're not quite poems.
Mhm.
So what is the difference there? I think that's interesting.
And I think sometimes it's not necessarily, I don't think the fragment is always by any means a dodge or whatever, but I felt that with this subject matter for me, it would have been. I easily could have used it that way.
That's fascinating. Well, I would love to ask you what your experience was like writing so much and bringing to life a family member's story. I mean, so much of your book would I mean, I love how you do this so imaginatively, where it's like, I wasn't here yet, this was my mother's experience, and then I feel like I'm there. I think that's part of the magic of an essay, that you can use narrative that way and kind of open up time. But
Yeah.
yes, I'd love to hear you speak about that. And then you include the letters too, which I love reading. But I'm curious about that dynamic. Like, what did you decide to include in a letter? What did you decide to like bring to life? How did that work for you process wise?
So I went through many drafts with this book. And the initial drafts were much more letter than not. They were almost like a gloss on the letters. And over time, the letters both, I think I was able to winnow them down to just the essential pieces and figure out the right frames for them with my own writing. And it took me a long time to give myself permission to just write things I wasn't there for. But and that came relatively late, I would say, in the process, that I decided to just do that. And, along the way, I was reading different pieces of nonfiction and thinking, yeah, I can just do that. I can just do that. But, you'll read people who write with great authority and confidence. I remember I'm trying to, one book that was really important to me in the process of writing this was Jessamine Ward's Men We Reaped, just written with great authority and confidence. And of course, because it's Jessamine Ward. And so the more I read these sort of very like confident works of nonfiction, I was like, all right, I can do this. I can fill those pieces in.
I love that.
Yeah. How about for you? I am curious about what pieces, so there's the pursuit of what I think of as the bomb cloud. So early on, there's an introductory piece, which I have highlighted because I like it so much. Let me find it. Here it is, where you write, "This is a story about an erasure, many erasures. The erasure of peoples, places, and facts that cloud the development of the atomic bomb. I make no claim to fill the gaps. What I have done is to articulate the shape of the cloud that obscures them, to notice the holes at the fences so that when I peer through them, I understand my limits and also what else might be outside my frame of knowledge." So that for me was really like a guiding moment. And there is this kind of development throughout the book of the bomb cloud as an image, but also as like a inquiry. I'm curious about everything else that comes into the book, which totally delighted me. I'm thinking of, you know, the little pieces, like there's a little flash essay called Boot. That, so there are all these little pieces that are about things that relate in a way that is not like straightforwardly logical. I'm curious about how you corralled everything and how you developed all of this, how you developed the sense of aboutness about what might be included or not.
Mm. I mean, I'm a really organic writer when I think about process, and I was joking with my editor recently because I feel like I had written this in such a personal way by hand, and then so to see someone else hold my book, sometimes I'm like, wait, oh, you have that too. Like, oh, you didn't just make this for me to have. It's like a nice thing that I thank you. But yeah. So so when I think about that essay Boot, I mean it started out as a draft, like a handwritten draft in a sketchbook, which is how I write a lot of my pieces. But I think I was trying to think three-dimensionally in a way that makes sense to my brain about this subject. So the Boot piece was a like a short section about a trip that I took to the Trinity crater, and like a very small incident in that trip, and I wanted to try to isolate like one component of it because I felt like there was a larger story that was a kind of travel essay that was separate, but then there was this like piece of it that I felt like needed more time to I don't know, to like live in the book. So I also wanted to just step back and focus on that as a in a lyric essay. So I think I was thinking about form in that way. Like sometimes I would find a motif and then feel like I needed a little more time with it, or to kind of ask questions of it, or look at it metaphorically outside of the narrative structure that one of the essays might be taking. So I think that that's the best way that I have of answering your question. But I think too, when I'm thinking about erasures, I kept facing redacted texts and the peoples and histories who were erased from the land, and just the profound violence of whiteness. And so I was thinking too about like whose stories aren't here, how to honor those stories without adding trauma, but and how to go about capturing the what could have been in the what was, I suppose. When you realize that something isn't there, not because it's you can't find it, it's like you'll never find it. So yeah, perhaps that also shaped my process. It's a good question though. Um, I think, let's see. Well, I would love to ask you another, like, what do you, I mean, this is a question I think so many of us have as writers. And so as I was reading your book, I kept thinking about it, because I think you handle it so well. Like what is at stake for the present self, the writer now, when writing about childhood homes and spaces, especially like transient ones?
Mhm.
And what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? How does that inflect and affect you as the writer? I mean, and as the person too, like how is self-care part of that process? I just
Mhm.
think you so beautifully like talk about the way that like mothering brought up these memories of being at the mines, being at camp, and what it means to like create and fashion home and then move that home. And then how does your identity shift as a new parent?
Yeah. So a lot of what is at the heart of the book for me was that having a child reawakened a lot of self-displacement, like feelings of being displaced even from your own self. So writing about place for me in this sense you know, being able to sort of cohere as a person was actually the first sense of place. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest things that's at stake. And it became an investigation of why do I feel that way? Why do I fear this? And it, did get back to the history of for the personal history of mining, which is also linked to the cultural history of mining, which I think is linked to a national story, similarly to your book, about, white people on the land, and a purpose being, the purpose there being extraction. And I'm sorry, I'm just kind of pinging between ideas here. Like extraction, but the family then becomes in service to that, in service to industry. And both industry and the family are like in service to empire. And how can you, it troubles the notion of a purposeful self. It troubles the notion of care, because actually none of this culture that surrounds us and that is supposed to support us was designed for care. It was designed for something else. Its imperative is something else. So those feelings of like displacement or invisibility sent me down this like investigative trail that led to childhood, that led to all of these other ideas. Does that sort of answer the question?
It totally does. Yes. No, I'm so interested in what you're saying about family being in service to industry. And I'm remembering, your question about what is care. I'm remembering a part of your memoir where there's a discussion of the mother making bread. And it's like, I love how as a writer, the persona is wrestling with, like, on the one hand, sounds like this like idealistic like homemaking act, but then it's also like there's no bread here. Like there's nothing here. Like she has to make bread because there's no store. And so that becomes an act of labor, and it's an act of caretaking, and then it's in large part invisible, and all that is in service to the industry as well, like the mining company, really. So I think I don't know, I really like how your book handles that.
I think another thing that we both write about, and that I really wanted to ask you about, was how, like, the ethics of writing about environmental damage and in the West and in places where there are not many people, and also in areas, or like, this is not like landfill sort, like no one romanticizes a landfill, but people do romanticize the atomic age, as well as precious metals mining. These are both like sites of both damage and myth. So I'm curious about like what was on your mind when you were writing about those things.
That's, yes. I think that I was always trying to articulate whose stories were left out of the narrative. So in the section of the essay that I had shared with you, Boom, it continues into looking at the history of Los Alamos, and it's about part of it's about my journey there, strolling through town and going into the center of town and seeing a log cabin, and then seeing that what it had been a cabin owned by Victor Romero and Refugio Sanchez, and it was for their 6 kids and everything, and then it had been moved So the US government moved it off the land. And so that's just such a profoundly violent act, because people in New Mexico who've lived there for hundreds of years, like there's this intense tie to the land. And so just to think about the fact that this family was, like so many, they were kicked off their land, and then this cabin was like lifted out of that space, which became technical area 55, where no one can go now. And now the cabin is like plunked down into Los Alamos, as though that it's this like historical site or something. I found that to be profoundly violent and troubling. And so I think that I'm interested in considering what the kinds of narratives exist, and what counter narratives convey the truth. And I think that was part of my project, was trying to articulate that, while also being aware of my own positionality too, as someone traveling through and moving through the space. And so I think that's why I wanted to write my body into the story as well. That felt really important to me. But what you're saying is right about the romanticization of the atomic age, and the film, the Oppenheimer film, which is very famous, but I think it's like it glorifies whiteness, and it just whitewashes the history of Los Alamos in ways that really bother me. So I hear you. I about that. So I think intersecting the personal within that space is important, and working in information and research too, I think, can be a way into that. How did you approach that in your own work?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I tried to hold the idea that like there's romantic mythology around this that I don't want to perpetuate. And some of that I tried to accomplish simply by showing the reality of it being often unpleasant. But also, and I came to this sort of in layers over time. Also, I tried to also like expose where I could, the extractive element of it, like this much metal came out of these places, which is often shown, which is against the narrative of like a guy with nothing came and struck it rich, for example, right? But actually, like over time, this much value was taken from these small places. And I also tried to write like I called it the non-commodity shape of metal. I tried to construct as a thread through the book the intact earth as sort of the solid thing, which is like a subtle way of working against extraction, but it was what I tried to do. I think I often felt that I did not do a good enough job of working against Indigenous erasure, which is a huge part of the West, and also against like just I found it very difficult to write one story and a personal story and a story based in childhood and memory within the context of the massive violent history that is so large that it would swamp any narrative, which is not to say that it cannot be done, but that I personally found it really challenging to consider.
I'm remembering you were writing about mining and uranium mining in particular. And I was thinking that that's an intersection of some of what our books look at, and thinking about the violence to the Navajo people and the lies that the government told. And
yeah, which I got just through like quickly Googling again. And yes, I was again also thinking about like whose stories are not, what am I not seeing here? What am I not? Because in the inherited version of that, it was like, this is all empty. And I thought, not so sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a problem. I think I find myself so furious too to think about just how the West is regarded as an empty landscape to become a receptacle. Like, just because thinking about like where should nuclear waste go? It's like always somewhere in the West.
The West.
So as though like no one's there and nothing is there. And I find that so infuriating. And yeah, I don't know. I want to keep writing about that. Yes.
Is it a good time to turn it over to the audience, do you think? I would be open to that.
I'd like that too. Yeah.
We did have one question from Lisa that came in earlier. It's in the chat. And I find myself wondering how on earth you wrote these books, meaning how did you fit writing prose into your life, and how did you structure the writing process? Did you write while you researched or after?
Well,
Lisa, wonderful
both of you. So
I'm like, well, I feel like I kept avoiding finishing this book, and I had a friend told me to apply for a grant, and I said, well, I'm never going to get this. Sure, I guess I'll try. And I did. And it was the first, like, I've never received a grant before, so I didn't realize you have to show what you did with the money, right? So they were great, and they helped me with childcare, and a little bit of travel. And then they're like, all right, well, where's your book? You said your book would be done. Where is it? And I was like, it's like coming along. They're like, well, can we have it now? I'm like, not yet. So but I'm so grateful. It was the Cafe Real Foundation, because I really think that they made me finish this book. They offered some support that I really needed, and then made me do it. But I feel like my process is really organic and messy. And when I look back at that time, I mean, my older daughter was a whole lot younger then. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I remember writing in notebooks. I remember setting timers for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and telling myself, all right, no matter what, I'm going to write for 30 minutes today, and then doing that. And I remember like writing some research on one page of a notebook and some research in a Word doc, and then having to figure out where all that stuff was. So I'm not a very linear thinker. And so, yeah, my process is extremely messy. So it feels a bit mysterious even to me, I would say. How would you answer that question, Jessica?
It was really, really hard. And it didn't necessarily have to be that hard. I wonder, well, I guess I made a decision early on not to approach it as essays and to try to write it as a single, like, I mean, obviously the book has parts, but I tried to write it as a whole chunk, like as something that I wanted people to be drawn into it and to want to keep reading. And I think, I'm not sure why I chose that, except that I think that I didn't trust my ability to make the essays collect in a good way. And so what happened was there were some parts that I knew I could write sort of from experience and what I had on hand. And I remember that when I started, at some point I had about 17 pages, which seemed like maybe more prose than I'd written, except like academic work. And I remember just feeling terrified because I felt like I couldn't hold it all in my mind. I didn't know what to do with it next. And I did research a little bit. I would go and I did so much research that's not in the book, and I wrote so much that's not in the book, to sort of try to find the right frames for all of this. And what would happen was I would reach this point where I would feel like I had written myself into a dead end. And then I would stop in frustration and I would go for a walk. And somewhere on the walk, between the walk and into the next day, I would figure out the next thing to write. So I just had to figure out a way every day to keep going. But every day I thought I had come up against the limits of what I could hold in my mind and what I could write through. And then I would keep going. And then I would rewrite it again. I mean, I think I have like 200 files on my computer that relate to this book. So it was really laborious, but my brain did eventually figure out how to hold the book. And just like a poet sees a poem, eventually I could hold longer pieces of prose in my mind and think through them and manipulate them. But it took a long time to just grow that capacity. Does that answer your question?
I think that was great. And now we are getting lots of questions coming in. So this is so exciting. From Lisa, another Lisa, I'm curious how you move between genres. Is your poetry brain different than your prose brain? And how so, if so?
I think for me, it mostly depends on what I'm reading and teaching. Like when I'm reading and teaching a lot of poetry, I'm probably more keyed into poetry. And that's what's going to occur to me. But I will say that writing this book has probably made me go to prose first in most cases, except when I'm teaching. When I'm teaching poetry, I'm always like a little more engaged with it and wanting to write poetry. And I wrote Metabolics, which some of you know and have read, to blow off steam from this book, from the frustrations of writing this. It was sort of like okay, I can do something more manageable in scope project. So what about you, Tyler?
Wow. I mean, I love what you're saying about the mind not holding the story. And I do think that in prose, I found myself having to trust the page to hold the tale and trust the many pages and almost like give the piece, yeah, give my mind to the page because I couldn't hold everything there at one time. With poetry, I feel like sometimes the voice just appears. It's like the voice that comes from somewhere else. It'll just pop up with a line when I'm walking, or I'll hear a scrap of conversation and it'll spark a question. And I feel like it's this very old, like ancient, I don't know, like drive or something, where I'm like, oh yes, that's a poem. I don't know why. I don't know how it'll be a finished poem, but this is calling me to speech in a different way than an essay. Yeah. But I also too like to give myself prompts. I mean, I've written a prompt book recently because I find myself like sometimes in emotional headspace, or emotional space and headspace where I want to write a poem, and then I'll say, okay, like I'm going to give myself some tools so that I'm like gathering the paints and brushes for myself metaphorically, and I'm not encountering the blank page as a blank page anymore. And so I like to do that, and I like prompts for that reason too.
Mm. Yeah.
Tyler, I'm really excited for your prompt book. I'm a big prompt fan, and I'm excited for it to come out. Sally put a question in the chat. It's specifically for Jessica. Earlier, you mentioned that you had approached this subject through had you approached this subject through poetry, you would have been untruthful or disingenuous. Could you speak more about this? What about the genre of poetry would have changed the nature of this project?
Thanks for the question, Sally. So I could just imagine myself like way down in a close-up moment and ending on a resonant image and just sort of letting it hang there without like interrogating. I really wanted to be able to interrogate the imagery that I came up with, I guess. And once again, there are poets who can do absolutely everything. But I could feel what I myself was wanting to do with some of this, which was just like the places in the book are really striking, and the imagery that I've made or uncovered or whatever, the imagery that has arisen from mining is pretty striking and powerful. And I thought it would have been really easy for me to just let this stuff rest on compelling imagery, but the ethical dimension would have been lost. Just if that works.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
We do have another question from Gabriel. Since both of you wrote about topics deeply rooted in a complex history, what parts of those histories did you find most impactful or interesting to research?
I found myself fascinated by historical accounts written during the Cold War, because I was noticing that what am I trying to say here? Narratives were being written before they had solidified into kind of national stories. And so I found myself really compelled by writers who were asking serious questions about ethics, about, why the atomic bombs had been dropped, what could have been done otherwise. Like there's really interesting writing during that time, and also just the ways that those two bombings were written about then in the 50s and 60s. It's completely different now. I now that the narrative has been shaped. So when I was sitting with some texts that I had found at the New York Public Library and pulled up from the archives, I found myself just really compelled by that, and asking about like how histories and narratives get shaped and when. So I think that's how I would answer your question. It's a good one.
I'm super curious about like what was different about the way it was narrated in the day.
All I'll say is that I'll like let it be, but there's a huge difference between the way that the two bombings were written about then versus now, and a lot of conflicting stories about what happened during the Nagasaki bombing. pilots were confused about what plane they were on, for example. They like crash landed on the wrong island. It's unclear. I mean, well, anyway, I'm really careful about saying things like I want to make sure that I'm speaking truth always, and so I'll just like let that be, because there's some bits of information that kind of can lead you to conclusions that I don't want to convey verbally now. But there's a lot of questions about what exactly happened that day and who authorized it and why that location was chosen and when it was actually chosen. So, and that was completely different than other narratives of that bombing that I had read much later on. So I think I was interested in that, and just looking back at kind of both like writings during the Cold War, and then also like thinking about writing closer in proximity to time to the events that I was working with, and just thinking about history and historical narratives becoming national narratives, if that makes sense.
And I think I would answer, I was thinking about like, how will I answer this? One thing that was super fun for me was like just going into the work of local historical societies in these little tiny places where we lived. And hyper local facts and histories that are not really important to anybody except people who live there and are just important for the sake of that, were really enjoyable to come across, because they seem to be put together by people for people, sort of. And then a wild thing that happened in my book is that there's a place my parents lived in Eastern Oregon. I lived too, and stayed longer than some of the others. And a lot of my mom's correspondence comes from there because it was unusually difficult. And from that place, someone else who worked in that place wrote a book about the experience. And when I was midway through writing, I mean, I think it was like kind of late in the game that that book was published. It was self-published by him. And to see someone else's account was fascinating, and it filled in a lot of the gaps. And like my parents are in it. So that was fascinating when you're like writing about other people, and then find that other people have also written about your family at the same time. Was really interesting.
Have you ever thought or encountered a kind of story that you could have written about this, like the miner's wife story, or like
Oh, yeah.
a kind of like very romanticized version?
Well, that person's version it was more the miner, and it was very romanticized. I have been working on like potentially a companion essay about the sex work industry in Wallace, one of the other towns where we lived, and definitely uncovered a lot of romanticized stories about gender in the West. But the miner's wife, like the miner's wife, I have not particularly uncovered that, except I did read a lot of Old West women's narratives as sort of like to prepare the frame, correspondence, diaries. None of those made it into the book, although in like previous versions, it was a whole chapter of, me commenting on them. And they were quite interesting to come across, actually. And not actually, again, in my view, most of them were not did not support the West narrative particularly. Like many of them were just despondent and wanted to go back.
Mm. Wow.
I think we don't have any more questions in the chat. We've about 15 more minutes left, maybe 10. I didn't know if you wanted to close with a short reading or if you wanted to close with something else, or just want to give that time check.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Let me think. Feel free to go first if you want to, Tyler.
Okay. I think, I think I'll read another Flash piece called Body. And it was written when I was living in a former railroad town in New Mexico in the northern mountains. And this essay is all in one sentence. And it's about a murder that had happened in that town when I was living there. And something else to know about about this essay is that the town itself is often used in film and TV, and so it was the set of the TV show Longmire, but it's also been in a lot of movies. So there's a little bit of play with that too in the essay. Body, New Mexico. Monday, and children were walking through the streets, plastic packs on their backs like oxygen tanks for the moon, and pickup trucks, Fords, and Chevys lingered bumper to bumper outside the police station and looped around the plaza with its white gazebo and statue of the Virgin. And the sun looked like liquid, and the road leading away that bridged the river's slush of mud and Doritos bags became a TV set, yellow tape, film crew, a sheriff in a Stetson. And that's what I thought when I saw the barricades, and that's what a friend thought because the TV show staging our town to be Wyoming wanted to use his front door. And in the cafe, I sat at the wood table on a chair with legs uneven as a teenager's jeans and rocked side to side like I was riding in an old van when the children suddenly flooded in, their voices quick in the afternoon air like little bells. And they shouted each other's names and tried to laugh out the dark that was beginning to shimmer almost green in the windows with a luster I can't describe, the changing light cueing something about to fly off the stage of the world like deck umbrellas no one remembered to bring in before a hurricane. But there are no hurricanes here. And then a word began echoing in the room all around me, beginning in the mouths of the children and easing into noise, a garble of gossip, approaching like a snake you hardly hear gliding over gravel. But its presence made us look at each other differently, peripherally, and I found myself thinking of never and wanting to construct lies with it like, I never stood by a creek and watched water glass the sky, and I was never as young as that table of kids, their cheeks flushed pink with sugar. And the rumor suddenly wore its vowels and consonants loudly. Body, the children said, body. And then I heard parents say, body in the back of a pickup truck, and then parked on the street out there. Then dead, dead, driven down from the mountains. The state called in. Body killed up by the hot springs, killed up by the community college, dumped at night in the pickup bed and driven into town as though for a parade. And someone did this, lives here, shot the body in the head or slit the throat with a kitchen knife. And I could see the truck through the window, person gone, the bed that carried it lifted up on a hook and chain, the vehicle almost a persona of a vehicle. And I thought about how evidence can seem like a curtain pulled shut in a window. And outside on the corner, a grassroots journalist talked at the screen of her phone about disappeared women, how many there are, how mothers and sisters order t-shirts printed with birthday and yearbook photos of them smiling, and wear the dead over the ribs and chest and lungs. Mothers and sisters and cousins marched in the fiesta parade chanting justice. But later I heard that the body belonged to a man my friend's co-worker's neighbor knew, and the paper did not give a name, just body and individual, the language of free enterprise. And at the edge of it all, someone read body and watched the sun rise, this time no bones in the ground, and thought how easy it was.
Mm. That was so good. I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of Metalwork. Silver and gold have a price. At this writing, $24 and $1,936 per troy ounce, respectively. Silver conducts electricity and heat better than any element on Earth. Films glazed or studded with silver salts and exposed to light turn into pictures as the silver splits from chloride or bromide, becomes pure Ag, and darkens. Silver has antimicrobial properties. On 19th century wagon trains, settlers prevented illness by drinking from milk bottles that held silver coins. Highly reflective, silver powers solar panels and slicks the backs of mirrors. A silver bullet is a solution so effective it might not be real. And gold keeps its luster. It's unsullied by the air. Gold jewelry and bricks fill Dubai vending machines. Gold salts injected in the synovial space soothe inflamed joints. Gold leaves buildings and covers chocolate and floats at the bottoms of schnapps bottles and patches troubled teeth. In language, it replaces virtue and safety. You're golden, good as gold, golden boy, golden years. Metals come from mountains, where the still hardening rock once held metal-rich brines that heated and cooled, rose and receded, traveled through cracks, reacting all the way, and left behind silver, gold, copper, lead, and their alloys. Veins are one structure this process makes. They stretch into the hard formations, filling fissures. Their shape is often less like a tube and more like a hand, whole families of them like jagged sheets of paper laid through the mountains. This is the non-commodity shape of metal, embedded in its surroundings and existing for its own sake as part of the Earth's story. The plane that marks the difference between metal and non-metal is called the selvage, a word for the divide created by the nature of a thing itself, the self-edge. As mountains weather, metal flakes away, runs with the rain, and collects in the slowest parts of a river. This is often the first way people take the metal out of the earth. They squat to sift the stream for what's visible. And when no more is visible, they dredge the river bottom. And when they've removed the river gold, they begin to tunnel. They crush rock to extract, through first physical and then chemical means, substances with unusual shine.
I love that. That was so beautiful.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Thank you for having us, Notebooks Collective.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
Thank you,
Oh
everyone who
my
came.
gosh. It was so lovely. It was so lovely. It so much to think about and kind of sit with. Yes, thank you. I think we have our like little closing remarks, but they're very short. I'm still melting here. Lisa, do you have them available?
I can have them available. Yes.
Thank you.
A shameless plug to please follow the Notebooks Collective on our social media accounts and to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. We will drop the link in the chat. We promise we don't spam you. We send out information about events that are coming up, and that's all. We would love for everybody to unmute and so that our guests can get a round of applause that they most richly deserve. So if you would like to do that, that would be really great.
Or say hello if you're.
Or say hello if you would like to.
I know.
It's so funny how everybody's quiet and shy. But everybody asked such good questions, which was great. We do have an In Conversation event coming up next month with Eugenia Lee and Diana Lee Antigua. We would love to see you there. I am dropping the link in the chat. And if nobody wants to say anything, then we will say good night and we hope to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.